Good afternoon, transit folks. We're going to go ahead and let you get settled, and we're going to start our program here this afternoon. Welcome to the State Transit Association webinar. Our network is growing as we've added 2 state associations since our last webinar back in 2021, North Carolina and Georgia. Today's session is called Federal Snapshot, Decisions in DC and What Lies Ahead. We're all wondering what the recent midterm elections mean to public transportation, so we'll learn today more about that. We'll also be focusing on the recent exciting actions at the federal level that will affect our agencies and our industry. You may be familiar now with the 12 state associations who joined together and combine efforts and resources to bring knowledge and professional development to their members. I'm from one of those state associations. I'm Rich Sampson, Executive Director of the Southwest Transit Association, SWATA, and I'll be the MC for today's program. Also hosting with me are Lisa Bacot, Executive Director of the Florida Public Transit Association, and Lisa Guthrie, Executive Director of the Virginia Transit Association. Danny Plogger, Deputy Director of the Virginia Transit Association, is our Zoom master today. And joining us are members from the following state transit associations: California Association of Coordinated Transportation, CalACT; Colorado Association of Transit Agencies, CASTA; Florida Public Transportation Association; Georgia Transit Association; Illinois Public Transportation Association; North Carolina Public Transportation Association; Pennsylvania Public Transportation Association; Southwest Transit Association; Tennessee Public Transportation Association, and the Virginia Transit Association, and Washington State Transit Association. Also, the Arizona Transit Association. I think I missed that one at the top. Welcome to all of you from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We'd like to take a few moments to ask some poll questions throughout our webinar today. And as you see on the map today, you can see the state associations that are joined on this map. The yellow is the SWATA Nation, as we call it, which also includes the members of the Arizona and Colorado associations joining us directly from those states. So welcome to everybody. So as I mentioned, we're going to ask some poll questions throughout our webinar today. I'm going to ask Danny to put up the first live poll question now. We've allowed time at the end of today's webinar for your questions. Please go ahead and enter them into the chat box throughout the presentations, and we'll address them at the appropriate time. We want to make sure all our presenters get a good time with you today and get some questions to them directly. We are recording today's session and will be available through your state association soon for on-demand viewing. The webinar will focus on the outcomes of the recent federal elections, as well as state and local elections, and we will and what that means to the implementation of the IIJA, the tax credits included in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, flood appropriations, and how it may all affect you, your agency, and your state. That's a lot of new changes and a lot of positive potential for public transportation. We've devised a couple of quickie online surveys for you today that'll help guide our discussions, and you saw those pop up a couple of minutes ago. The first survey gathers some basic information about your transit agency, and let's take a look at that and allow you a few minutes to respond, just a couple here. Take a look at which type of organization or company do you represent? Which geographic region are you joining us from today? And also, what's your top priority for legislative and policy matters for our expert panel of presenters today? And so just take a few moments of those, and we'll get the results to you in just a couple seconds here. And while we're waiting for that, we're happy to introduce our panel of transit advocates today. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Bacot, who will introduce Ward McCarriger.
Okay, thank you so much, Rich. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I get to introduce Ward McCarriger. He is the Vice President of Government Relations and Advocacy of the American Public Transportation Association, or APTA. In this role, Ward leads APTA's outreach and advocacy efforts to Congress and the administration, such as APTA's successful advocacy on behalf of the historic investment for public transit and passenger rail included in the IIJA, the IRA, and COVID-19 relief legislation. Ward will be covering the congressional elections, flood appropriations, IIJA, NOFOs, APTA's actions on the IRA tax credits, and all the challenges with implementation of these momentous actions. So thanks for joining us, Ward, and Rich, I will pass it back to you.
All right, next after Ward will be Katie Catchell, principal at Blank Rome Government Relations in Washington, D.C., where she advocates on behalf of public transit agencies and other municipal and transportation interests before the U.S. Congress and federal agencies. She currently represents our members at the Southwest Transit Association. Katie will be focusing on how transit agencies can make the most of provisions in the recent legislation. She also contribute to the appropriations discussion and share her views on what we can expect with committee leadership assignments coming up. And next, Lisa Guthrie from Virginia will introduce Scott Bogren.
Good afternoon. Finally, we welcome Scott Bogren. Scott is the Executive Director of CTAA, the Community Transportation Association of America. Scott has been with CTAA since 1989 and has served as their ED since 2016. His work has always focused on building and promoting safe, affordable, accessible, and inclusive mobility for all Americans. Scott will focus on the small vehicle crisis stemming from the nationwide purchasing issues and inflation. He'll also share thoughts with us about the low emission grants and procurement. Welcome, Scott.
All right, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Scott. And we're going to turn it over to Ward McCarriger now from APTA, and he'll share with you his thoughts on all things that APTA is paying attention to in Washington. Take it away, Ward.
Thanks, Rich, and thank you to all the state association leaders for the invitation to be here today and to talk about some of these issues in terms of the election and what we can expect through the fall and for the new Congress. Next slide. Let's begin with the congressional elections in the House of Representatives. As you know, there was a lot of predictions of a red wave, and it didn't happen. And we saw the same thing in 2020 when there were a lot of predictions of a blue wave. I think if anything, it tells us we have a very evenly divided country, and it makes it hard for Congress to get things done. For this Congress, we have a very narrow Democratic majority, and in the new Congress, it will possibly be even more narrow with a Republican majority. Now in Washington, even to the party committees, this outcome came as a shock on both sides. For election night, the House Republicans had 2 ballrooms set aside for a party. The Democrats didn't even have a party scheduled, and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, was planning a trip to Egypt the next day. The shock on the Republican side in terms of the election outcomes is having repercussions as we see they're planning for next year's agenda and some of the leadership races. And although this majority is much smaller in the House than Republicans envisioned a few days ago, they still hold the gavels, which will enable them to set both the legislative and oversight agenda. Now, this slide shows the new representatives. It's almost 75 at this point in time. And we saw this same huge wave of new members in 2018 and 2020. And it represents a real sea change in the House of Representatives. It includes many more moderate Republicans from what would be Biden districts in blue states like New York and New Jersey, and provides APTA and the state association members a real opportunity to create more Republican champions for transit. As we look at our advocacy agenda for APTA, we're focusing on education first. Next slide. So in the Senate, incredibly evenly divided. 50-50 under this Congress. It's 50-49 right now. All eyes are on Georgia in the December 6th runoff as to whether it will be 51-49 or 50-50 again. Either way, the Democrats will control the majority, but that one seat will make a difference in terms of their ability to move their agenda forward. On the Republican side, because they had expected a better election outcome, there is a lot of finger pointing going on both sides. Next slide. So there are 7 new senators. The majority come with Washington experience, and this is different from the last Congress, where you had astronauts and football coaches. With this election, you've got former representatives, former staff, other governmental officials, probably with the exception of J.D. Vance. All of them are coming with significant government experience. And hopefully that will give them at least some understanding of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Next slide. So looking at the House leaderships, on the Democratic and Republican sides. House Republicans elected their new leadership last week. Kevin McCarthy was nominated as Speaker by a vote of 188 to 31 against a conservative Freedom Caucus challenger. On the Democratic side, you've seen three leaders, Speaker Pelosi, Leader Hoyer, and Whip Clyburn, have shepherded House Democrats for 2 decades. Last week, Speaker Pelosi and Leader Hoyer stepped aside, and we're likely to see a diverse ticket of Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark, and Pete Aguilar move into these 3 top positions. Congressman Clyburn hasn't exactly stated what position he would like to continue in, but he does want to continue in some role in the Democratic leadership. So I think they're navigating how they're going to go about that. We'll see those elections immediately after Thanksgiving. Now, for the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, even though he's won the overwhelming majority of his Republican conference, that race is not settled. The way that the Speaker's vote works is that you need not just a majority of your conference or party, you need a majority of the House of Representatives. So at noon on January 3rd, he has to get 218 votes on that day to become Speaker of the House. And he's currently 30 votes short. So we're going to see a lot of negotiations with some of the House conservatives between now and January 3rd before he becomes Speaker. And it's possible that this doesn't get resolved on the first ballot. It's been 100 years since it's happened, but he's got some work to do to solidify his support. Next slide. So in terms of some of the key committee leaders, looking at appropriations and authorizing committees. First, on appropriations, I expect current Transportation Housing Ranking Member Mario Diaz-Balart to seek the chairmanship of the subcommittee. He is currently operating under a waiver of their 6-year term limit rule. He will need a continuation of that waiver to continue in that role. But right now, unless there are broad changes to Republican rules in their conference, I would expect him to proceed with that, along with some other senior members of that committee. And then on the Democratic side, Rep. Quigley is currently expected to replace Chairman Price, who is retiring. Next slide. Looking at the authorizing committee and the House T&I committee, Republican leader Graves will become the new chairman. On the key subcommittee leaders, it's a little less clear. I think right now I would expect Representative Crawford to become the chairman of the Highways and Transit subcommittee. If he's successful, there'll be a new railroad subcommittee chair. And then on the Democratic side, Chairman DeFazio is retiring, and both Representative Norton and Representative Larson are vying for that top position. If Representative Larson wins the position, Ms. Norton will remain as the top Democrat on the Highways and Transit subcommittee. Looking at the Senate leadership. Next slide, please. Regarding the Senate, the Democratic and House leaders generally are going to continue in their current roles. Last week, Republicans elected their new leadership. So Senator McConnell faced a challenge from Senator Scott of Florida as the finger pointing kind of continues among Republicans about the poor outcome in the election, but he won overwhelmingly and will continue in that role. The Democrats don't hold their election until immediately after Thanksgiving, but I do expect Senator Schumer to continue as majority leader, which provides him the ability to set the agenda for legislation and nominations. Now, Senator Murray is vacating her number 3 position because of her other duties, and it's not clear at this point how the Democratic leadership will restructure their leadership with that vacancy. Next slide. So on the other key kind of committee leaders, Senator Murray and Senator Collins will be the new leaders of the Appropriations Committee. And together with their House counterparts, for the first time in history, all 4 leaders will be women. On the THUD subcommittee, right now, I would expect Senator Bozeman to assume that role, but that may change because of Senate Republican term limits, which may affect other senators' assignments and could upset the apple cart in terms of the choosing of subcommittees. On the Senate Banking Committee, Ranking Member Toomey is retiring, and Senator Scott of South Carolina is expected to become the new Republican leader. And Senator Rounds, who's the current subcommittee leader for the Republicans, could continue in that new role, but he may have other positions that he prefers in terms of other subcommittees. Next slide. So what does this mean in terms of the getting bills done this fall? Now, as you know, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provides a historic $108 billion for public transit over the next 5 years. However, each and every year, the Transportation Appropriations, or THUD Act, must confirm these amounts. APTA's advocacy is focused on ensuring that Congress honors the promise of the IIJA in each year. In 2022, we had great success. They provided full funding for transit and the overwhelming majority of the passenger rail funding. Now, for this fiscal year 2023, in July, the House passed its bill and the Senate released its companion draft. And as you can see, they're close or above the 23 authorized levels, but there are some significant differences. The House bill provides $750 million more for transit and passenger rail. And these, at this point, are Democratic-only bills. To reach agreement, they will have to have both Democrats and Republican leaders on the appropriations committees agree to all the funding levels. So they have work to do. They were unable to complete action by October 1st, and so Congress passed a continuing resolution until December 16th. They're working to finish the bills by that point. And APTA's advocacy is focusing on getting the highest possible transit and rail funding and completing action this year. And we've got some real challenges on both fronts. Next slide. So the biggest difference between the two bills is capital investment grant funding for new BRT, light rail, subway, and commuter rail projects. And as you can see, the IIJA authorized significant increases in CIG. But this funding is not guaranteed. It is set each year through the THUD Appropriations Act. The House provides full funding, but the Senate bill is $500 million less. Now, today there's an enormous pipeline of projects, 81 projects, most of those BRT, requesting $47 billion in additional funds. We're working to ensure that Congress provide the full funding. Next slide. Now, the difficulty in getting the bill done this Congress is that you need, a bipartisan agreement. As we look to this in September, 42 House Republicans sent a letter to their colleagues stating that Republicans must do what is necessary to ensure that not one additional penny goes to the administration's radical inflationary agenda, and that they would oppose appropriations bills. Now, as Leader McCarthy is determining whether he should reach a bipartisan agreement this fall, he also has to be looking to January and locking down that 218 votes he needs for his speakership. It makes it difficult to see Congress reaching the agreement this year. So possible, we're working with it that it may happen, but it also has probably a 50-50 chance that this gets pushed off to the spring. Next slide. So the other area we're focused on is the enormous efforts in terms of the implementation of the IIJA, and particularly the notices of funding opportunities and competitive grant awards. So in the last 3 months, DOT has awarded more than $5 billion of competitive grants for transit, passenger rail, and DOT multimodal programs. Next slide. And there's another $6 billion currently in the queue for other competitive grant opportunities on the street right now. Next slide. And then yet this fall, probably in the next week or two, immediately after Thanksgiving, we'll see another $7 billion for intercity passenger rail made available. So in 2022 alone, we're going to see almost $19 billion of competitive grant opportunities that can fund public transit, passenger rail, and multimodal investments. I urge you to take advantage of these historic opportunities. Next slide. So in addition to our work on the IIJA, we're also aggressively working on implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, which President Biden signed into law in August. And it has three critical components important to public transit. One is it extends the tax credits for alternative fuels, such as CNG and biodiesel. Second, it creates a new tax credit for commercial vehicles that allow you to get $40,000 off the purchase of a zero-emission bus. And then lastly, it creates more than $30 billion, provides more than $30 billion for greenhouse gas reductions and other equity investments. Now, as the Department of Treasury and the Environmental Protection Agency and DOT implement these new initiatives, we're working to ensure that they make transit agencies eligible for the tax credits and that and the new grant programs, and they can receive direct payments under the tax credits in lieu of a credit. Next slide. And then with all of this, we're facing, with all this kind of wealth of opportunity, we're facing historic opportunities. Next slide, please. Capacity issues, both financial capacity of making the local match, workforce capacity, in terms of, as you know, the workforce shortage across the entire industry. Next bullet, please. Project delivery, supply chain, and cost escalation issues, which I know Scott is going to touch on. Next bullet. And then lastly, Buy America, and the new requirement that's just coming into effect now, that Buy America applies to construction materials for construction projects. Next slide. So our goal of getting the promise of the IIJA and seeing that completely put forward in this fiscal year and into the next fiscal year, the biggest challenge we have is probably less the traditional transportation appropriations bill than it is when there is a big budget deal that we are likely to see in the next Congress. This slide shows the current federal debt projection. And next year, the federal government will hit its cap of $31 trillion and need to increase it or suspend it. And that big budget deal, kind of increasing that cap, is where we're seeing a lot of focus among conservatives about wanting to leverage new budget spending caps, other elements. We want to ensure that whatever agreement is reached, that none of that impacts the greatest, the success that we're having in terms of implementing the IIJA and the Inflation Reduction Act. And lastly, as part of all this, whether it's for this new budget deal or as we look ahead several years, the key element, I think, for all of you is to tell your stories. We need to tell our stories of the successes of these acts and how it's enabling you to help your citizens and communities to ensure that Congress continues to provide these funds as we go forward. Next slide. And one plug here for APTA and its SMART Guide. We have a SMART Guide on the bipartisan infrastructure law, which you can find by just Googling that or going to our website. It will provide for you all of the notices of funding opportunity, all of the guidance provided by DOT and other agencies, all of APTA's comments on rulemakings, and kind of funding levels across the programs, the apportionments. It's got probably 200 documents on it at this point, and it's constantly being revised to provide updated information as you work toward implementation. So I do think it's a very good resource. And last slide, I think at the appropriate point, I'd be glad to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ward, so much. I appreciate all the work that you and your team at Apt to do, along with the leadership there and all the resources you provide on advocacy and legislation. It's such a great resource to the transit industry. And I'd like to turn it over to Katie Catchell, who we do a lot of work with across the SWATA Nation, a great, responsive, and active voice for transit on the Hill, who knows everybody and is in a ton of meetings every day and every week. So Katie, you can take it away from here.
Thank you, Ward. Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Ward, for your presentation. Can everyone hear me? I'm kind of dialing in because I wasn't sure of my internet security. Okay,
You
great.
sound good, Katie.
Perfect. Ward did a fantastic job giving you a lay of the land, and now I'm going to talk about some key takeaways on how transit agencies can maneuver in this landscape, taking advantage of opportunities while recognizing some of the risks that there might be more constraints on federal funding in the future. Next slide. This is my little attempt at humor here, my own version of that meme, looking at the different perspectives of different people. The top two pictures represent balancing what you do day to day, running transit, with what you will need to do to take advantage of these opportunities. The bottom two pictures represent the operating environment with the results of the midterm elections. The Biden administration will continue touting the bipartisan infrastructure law and will embrace having grantees talk about how the funding is proving to be a once-in-generation investment into our nation's infrastructure and competitiveness. Bottom right picture represents a view of what the midterm elections might mean for the transportation agenda. The incoming Republican-controlled controlled House will be conducting oversight hearings on BIL, inflation reduction, and other legislative accomplishments. Beyond appropriations battles, a Republican House also could have a very robust oversight agenda. Beyond that, some House members are raising the sector of they will control the House GOP will control the appropriations process on the House side. With regard to appropriations, it could mean that fully funding authorized transit and railroad programs is much less likely, as Ward touched upon the capital investment grant program, but also the railroad grant programs. Those were all, a lot of those were authorized levels, not actually appropriated in the BIL. There was some minimal level of appropriations, but not the full amount. These programs received advance appropriations in the VIL, but their advocates have been hoping for additional support in the annual appropriations process, just like the CIG is an annual appropriations exercise. If history is a guide, the CIG program will continue to get robust general fund approach, but just not to the full level authorized in the bipartisan infrastructure law. That's the risk. For railroad programs like CRISI and the Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail, it may mean actually little funding beyond what's already appropriated. All that being said, my advice in this operating environment is to not let these new risks bog you down too much. The focus should be taking advantage of grant funding and maybe tempering any big revolutionary rail project plans. As someone said, stick to your knitting. Another idiom I like to use is hurry up and wait, hence the top right picture. As we're touched upon, the bipartisan infrastructure law lays out a variety of funding for different programs. You want to take a look at your capital project list of needs and wants and sequence your projects to best match the particular federal grant program with where your project is actually in development, not only for eligibility purposes, but competitiveness. For example, if your project needs funding for planning and pre-construction, the competitive bus and bus facilities grant program is not going to be your first step. Bus and bus facilities are for capital programs. For planning, you might want to look at the RAISE grant program or the new Reconnecting Communities grant program. And you'll want to create a pipeline of projects, bringing them to the right level of readiness for each program. I was advertised to be talking about appropriations, so I'll touch upon earmarks. I would still advise that transit agencies find a couple of projects that could be done in the $1 to $5 million range. Assume a 20% non-federal match that could be spent within 1 year of the appropriations bill enactment. Most congressional offices require letters of support for earmarks and a certain level of project readiness and coordination with local planning. So now I'll read some tea leaves on appropriations. But again, my advice is to hurry up and wait and assume that they will happen. It's possible that Senate Democrats will continue earmarking for the next appropriation cycle. Not certain about House Republicans. Last week, the House Republican Conference was going to consider banning earmarks, but that vote was shelved. Assuming the Senate majority keeps earmarks in the chamber, it would be difficult for House Republicans, many who won't want to miss out on if the senators load up the bills with their own projects. And it seems likely that if Senate Democrats earmark, many Senate Republicans will also participate. Another point is the House Republicans now have 2 years of participating in the process to inform their decision making. And then there's the thinking that without earmarks, the Biden administration gets to spend all of its money on priorities and may not necessarily be priorities of the House GOP. And then there's the thinking that House Republican leaders might want to preserve earmarks as a bargaining chip to maintain conference unity during tough votes that are likely to be ahead. Again, back to my hurry up and wait. Regardless of the impact of the midterms, I'd advise you to stay on top of the grant cycle and be ready for potential earmarks. Once you do your grant planning and grant applications and getting your potential earmark candidates ready, yes, you may have to wait. Wait and see how Congress grapples with the divided Senate and House when it comes to appropriations and how programs are modified in appropriations bills. And yes, you can still expect 2023 federal grant NOFOs to be rolling out ahead of the 2023 appropriations bill. For example, RAISE is statutorily required to come out at the end of this month. As you might recall, 2022 RAISE came out ahead of the 22 approach, and in that NOFO, there was a placeholder that extra funds might be coming through approach, and there might be potential tweaks to the grant criteria. When Congress eventually did pass FY22 appropriations, they updated that RAISE NOFO. And if you haven't done competitive grant applications before, it is more work than you think. Whether you do it in-house or use a consultant, starting now is a very good idea. It would be very challenging to do a solid grant application if you wait until the NOFO is released. So that's what I've got for you today. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Katie. And just to encourage you, if you have questions about the earmarking process or the appropriations process, of course, the teams at APT and CTAA are there to help you, along with your state transit associations, who can connect you with that earmarking process or the appropriations process for your state's delegation. Of course, SWATA members can get in touch with me or Katie directly. So thank you, Katie, as always, for joining us. We appreciate your work. And next, I'll turn it over to someone who I had the privilege to work with for almost 20 years at CTAA, Scott Bogren, and he'll share with you CTAA's perspective on what's happening in Washington.
Well, thanks, Rich, and thanks to the invitation to speak today. And I just have a couple of slides here. You can advance to the next one. And also, thanks a lot to both Ward and Katie. I always learn a lot from their insights, and they went through a lot of really important and good advice quickly. I just would underscore what one of the things Katie mentioned for the smaller transit systems out there. There are so many NOFAs, so use this period between now and January 1st to get a sense of what you're going to be seeking in calendar year 2023, and understand that for a lot of smaller agencies, I know you can't respond to all of them, but prioritizing and working with places that you can get good resources to develop competitive grants. Really important right now to add those funds into what you're getting from a formula basis, which, as Ward mentioned, are growing and growing quickly. For us, we're working right now on developing our legislative and federal policy priorities for 2023. All CTA members will get that out to you in draft, and probably hold a webinar first week of January, take in some of your insights on what you need. Obviously, we like to make sure that whatever we are working on and advocating for, educating around, it is consistent with what you need. For a short list, next slide, I'll just go through a couple of issues. One, obviously, the effective implementation of the IIJA or the BIL, maintaining those funding levels, making sure that appropes are happening. All of us here in DC are going to be working to make sure that happens, and that is no small task. It's important. And really the historic levels of funding should not be looked past right now. Interestingly, I was in a meeting with FTA leadership a month ago. FTA noted that they'd obligated $41 billion in this calendar year, just to get a sense of the massive nature of what we're talking about. Ward and others have kind of set me up that I'm going to come here and solve or perfectly explain the impact of the supply chain crisis on certainly the small bus industry. That is an ongoing problem. I had meetings on that with folks this morning, and we continue to. The baseline is this. In the body on chassis world, there aren't enough chassis. We're seeing about 20% of what were available pre-pandemic, and that is a choke point on the ability for states and others to purchase these vehicles. And so a lot of what you got used to doing in the past doesn't work anymore, to say nothing of significant price increases, 70, 80% at the top end. I've worked with a couple of states that were complaining about 30% price increases, and I kind of told them, hey, you did well at 30%, take that and run to the bank. What we're doing about it is, we've asked the Secretary Buttigieg, and appreciated both APTA and Ward's commitment to participating in that letter, along with AASHTO and their leadership, asking for them to work with the manufacturing side to get more chassis into the pipeline. The other thing that you've all seen, there was a waiver that was done a couple of weeks ago, finalized for vans and minivans in the Vanpool side of our business. And that has a slight impact on what many of you do. This is not available for accessible vans and minivans. It's only for those. And we are looking at the efficacy of a waiver effort, a Buy America waiver effort for accessible vans and minivans. I do think that would provide some pressure relief from the system. I don't think it's a complete answer, but there are a lot of states and other agencies that are thinking about deploying minivans, but they're going to need to be accessible. So that's certainly an issue. And we published on our website, CTAA.org. My colleague, Chris Eilinger, put together an analysis that we put up on the site at the end of last week. So it's relatively new. That speaks to both the Vanpool waiver, some of the Dear Colleague letters, and some of the other actions that are happening right now in and around the supply chain crisis. And no, not any of these is a complete solution, but I think there's a lot of work going on, and I'm talking regularly with FTA leadership about procurement advice and flexibility that they can bring into the procurement process. I have a lot of concerns about what that's going to look like for those of you who are going through both state management reviews and triennial reviews. Procurement is always the top finding. I think it's going to be even more so in the short term because of what we're dealing with. I think we're going to be seeing a webinar from FTA looking at the flexibility that might be available in the procurement rules. So keep your eyes open for that. And I've asked them as well if they wouldn't mind doing that at our expo. I know that would be a real popular session. So, you know, on the small bus crisis and the supply chain issues, there's no easy answer. If there was, we'd have availed ourselves of it. And when it comes to, I agree with Ward, now all the construction materials, it's a challenge. And the challenge really is based upon the fact that we've got 20 to 30 years of the federal government, and through a lot of trade policies and economic policies, kind of encouraging a lot of manufacturing to leave the country. And at the same time now, this massive increase in bus capital and its impact. So our goals, CTA's goals, are twofold. within this crisis. One, we want to not let a good crisis go to waste, and we want to try to simplify and streamline the procurement piece. Second, we need more manufacturers. We need more and different manufacturers within what we can buy, which can keep the price down and keep innovation up. Another big goal for us legislatively is local share relief for rural transit agencies on the operating side. We'd like to see all match for rural agencies go to 80-20, 80 federal, 20 local. We've been working on that and kind of setting the table. We've worked a lot with Congressman Graves' office on this issue. So expect to see more from us on that. Renewing and supporting the transit workforce, a critical issue. The CDL rules and what they did, a lot of challenges in this place right now. We've got a lot of resources available, but any of you out there, a good group of operators that are in the audience today, if you've come up with things that are working, please share. We've got a lot of systems that are having trouble making pullout on a regular basis. There's a bill I wanted to point you to in the NEMT space, HR 8841. Representative Carter put this bill out, and this is basically taking and broadening the approach within the Medicare. So with dual eligibles, people who are eligible for both Medicare and Medicaid, this would be looking at repetitive, scheduled, non-emergency ambulance trips. And I think I've cut through that, and I tell you, think about things like dialysis. That Medicare is realizing that doing those in an ambulance doesn't make sense. This bill would broaden and allow some of those to be moved into the non-emergency transportation base. We'd like to see that. We think there's lots of CTA members around the country that could and should be doing those trips. Obviously, it's a very tight Congress, but with the House, with the Republicans at this point in time, we're going to try to bring together a common sense regulatory reform agenda. We could talk all day about these things. You know what they are, those regulations that don't make sense for smaller agencies, that are burdensome both financially and time-wise. And our members have been giving those to us kind of chapter and verse, but we want to focus and come up with an agenda that we can communicate to members of Congress here as we get into 2023 on ways to make that a little bit more palatable, particularly for smaller agencies. One of the things next to last bullet point there that a lot of people don't look at, Ward and I have talked about it in the past. There's a pot of funds that FTA has authorized that allows it to have money to respond immediately to emergencies and crises like hurricanes. That pot is never appropriated, and we think it should be appropriated because for so many reasons, between wildfires out west and hurricanes and flooding, we need the FTA to have the wherewithal to help out immediately in these cases. The FHWA has a similar pot that is not just authorized, but appropriated. We'd like to see transit appropriated. Last thing, in the bus facilities funding, which was combined with both no and low and bus facilities, which will happen again this year in terms of that combination. There was a stipulation in the bipartisan infrastructure law that 25% as a floor of the no and low emission funds had to be spent on low emission vehicles, CNG, hybrids, propane, and we missed by almost 60 million in that first year of these funds. So those of you who are out there who already have fleets that are in those CNG, hybrid, propane, this is going to be a really good opportunity. FTA has pledged to take that 60 million and drop that into the FY23 version of the bus. So there's going to be a lot of availability. If you are in that place, please propose. I think you'll be happy with what you get out of that. And we worked hard and long to make sure that there was low emission funding spent in the no-low program. I just want to urge all of our members out there to propose this year, and let's not leave that money sitting on the table. And with that, I know we're going to get to some questions. I think we got about 15 minutes, so we're right on schedule. So thanks to everyone. And let me be the first to wish everyone a happy and healthy Thanksgiving. And I hope you get to spend time with family and friends over the next few days.
All right, thanks, Scott. Appreciate you. And before we get to some questions for the panel, I'm just going to ask Danny to share the poll results from earlier in the session. We can just get a snapshot of who's joined us today. And while Danny's getting that all set up, just encourage you to share any questions or comments for the presenters in the chat box, and we'll get to those real soon. And you can see in the results from the poll, a good mix of folks joining us today from urban and rural and tribal systems, along with nonprofit organizations and planning groups, some suppliers from the industry, as well as some folks that don't really fit into any of those categories. So we had almost 190 folks join us today. So thank you to all of you. And kind of, again, a good breakdown of folks from all over the country. Maybe a little early for some of the folks out west, but good thing we have this recorded for everybody. But good showings from the south, southeast, and southwest. And then down at the bottom, the third question, a mixed bag of what's important, but new funding is always important to everybody, of course, and that was the largest response number, along with keeping track on appropriations, matching authorizations, the cost of vehicles and construction that Scott was spending a lot of time on, workforce shortages, does that apply to everybody? So again, a lot of different ways to channel your focus on policy and legislative activity coming up. And thank you to all three presenters for talking about all these topics on our session here today. So there's much to anticipate in the coming months. I'd like to take a moment to remind you that professional lobbyists in DC can't do it alone, like Katie. They need us back in our districts to be telling the stories at all levels of government so that they hear the work and the importance of these programs. You'll no doubt be asked to contact your representative or senator to tell them why more funding is needed. But hearing from you is that needed reinforcement that they need to support transit even when opponents are pushing back. An easy way to do that is to sign up for APTA's Voices for Public Transit effort, where you can get action alerts when timing is right, explaining what's at stake. So we'd encourage you to go ahead and sign up for that. All you need to do is click your mouse to send a pre-draft message to folks in Congress and their staff, and you can see that on screen right now. So thanks to APTA for putting up that work, and we know that CTAA has many of ways for their members to directly connect with them too, along with that. So let's take a time for some questions here. Again, put those in the chat box, but we have a few that we're going to have set up for our panelists, and I'm going to ask Lisa Bacot from Florida to share the first question for Ward.
Thanks, Rich. Yes, this is for Ward. The Biden administration has certainly been a key component in the recent movement forward to invest in transit's future. The IIJA and IRA are truly once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, as you mentioned in your presentation. What do you think the chances are of keeping the momentum going with the GOP majority that is now in the House?
I think there's a good opportunity. I think the biggest challenge, as I kind of mentioned, is probably a bigger budget bill, where we get wrapped in along with lots of things, where they do some across the board cuts and things. I think anything that's not guaranteed funding, say the CIG program, as Katie mentioned, some of the passenger rail programs, you will see definitely a different approach in the House with the House Republicans than you will from the Senate Democrats. I mean, that's just traditional. But at the end of the day, they need to work out a bipartisan bill that works for all four corners. So I think we're in pretty good shape for the General Transportation Appropriations Bill. However, I don't think people can sit on their heels on this. And I think, to Rich's point, I think for local entities to be telling their story back home is much more important than me reaching out to Republican members of Congress. Them hearing that from their constituent is what's going to get them to appreciate the importance of public transit in their districts and what it means for their states. I think that's more important than ever with a Republican-led House that you have that, and for the Senate for Republicans that maybe don't automatically see the benefits of transit that you might get on the other side. So you've got to do more education. A lot of that has to happen at the local level.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ward. And Scott or Katie, any follow-ups on that question? All right. Well, I have one for Katie next. Katie, elected officials always want to take credit for legislative achievements, no matter how they voted on them. What would you point to as the greatest achievements for transit that we've seen in the past year?
I mean, I thought this was an easy question, and I'm leaning towards IIJA, but then I also want to recognize that, you know, all of the COVID relief legislation that went into effect. I mean, that we're talking operating dollars for transit, like that was unheard of for a long, long time, and it really showed, you know, the strength of the transit story and why, you know, and people who didn't have choice but to still go to work and still ride transit. And, you know, these pieces of legislation, you know, kept transit alive. So on the other hand, I don't see, you know, funding for operating. I don't see this as like the starting of a new era of funding operations. So I think I'd have to go with my original answer of the IIJA and the bipartisan infrastructure law.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I think you make a really good point there, is that you know, we've had a couple of years of unprecedented levels of investment in transit. I know Ward shared a lot of details on that, and that shows to the strength of the effort that APTA and CTAA and others have been putting in over the past several decades in having a really strong presence for transit on the Hill and various administrations. And that's borne out in the COVID relief bills, as well as the current multi-year authorization. So I think that's a real good point, Katie. And we just want to remind folks that has happened and that's out there. And then I'll turn one more question. I see we have two in the chat box. That's great. But I know Lisa Guthrie from Virginia has one for Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. We've just been talking about the great achievements that we've experienced the last couple of years. So those federal actions really helped us. But how can transit providers ensure that transit remains a priority going forward?
Well, thanks, Lisa. And, you know, I'm going to jinx myself. I think one of my great achievements today is I haven't spoken while I've been on mute. So I feel like I'm doing really well here. But, you know, in terms of that, it's an important discussion. We need to have in calendar year 2023 a reality-based discussion with electeds at all levels. We're using words unprecedented, historic. I think I've heard other phrases, generational. And indeed, these funding levels in a vacuum, we never would have dreamed of 10 years ago, 5 years ago. But the reality base of the situation is labor costs a lot more. Our vehicles and capital costs a lot more. Many of you systems had significant increases in your energy costs in the past year. And I think we've got to tamp down expectations with electeds that overnight, they're going to see this radical change in public transit everywhere, that there's just going to be new vehicles, shiny new buses all over the place, and get to an understanding of the long-term implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, the long-term implications of the labor market, of the supply chain crisis. And I'm not saying that we're not grateful. We're very grateful. The funds that came through were a survival in many ways for many agencies, but it's going to take time. And I think we got to have a reality-based discussion with a lot of elected officials. And that's how we remain a priority, is making those expectations reality-based. And that's something only transit agencies and leadership at the local level can do.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. That's a real good point as well. You know, it's that balance of being grateful, but also expressing the facts on the ground. So thanks for sharing that. We have a couple questions here, and we're going to try and keep this just to an hour today, because we all know we're busy just before the holidays. But this first question, I encourage you all, if you're interested about NEMT, have a pen and paper ready to write down or type down this numbers for Scott. Is what was that bill number in the House on the NEMT ambulance bill, Scott?
See, I jinxed myself. Of course. HR 8841.
And I'm gonna send that to everybody in the Q&A box right now. And I wrote down that bill number so you can follow it. Of course, Scott and Chris over at CTAA are gonna be following that bill really closely. So if you have questions on it, feel free to check in with them. And then we have a question from Pam McCormick. When will we know the new members of congressional committees? So not just the leadership, but also who's going to be on those committees. Maybe Ward, if you want to start that, and then follow up, Katie, if you have any thoughts after Ward.
Sure. So it'll come in tiers. So you're going to see in December, the chairs and ranking members of the committees will be named. There'll be elections in each of the caucuses, and those names will get, kind of leaked out after the caucuses or the conference approves those. So that will occur on the House side for sure, generally, typically also on the Senate side. And as you see, there aren't a lot of disputes, but there definitely are some. I didn't name all the committees, but Ways and Means Republicans, there are 3 people running. It's not clear who's going to win that. So we'll see those. And they do them by tiers of, in essence, what Congress views as the most important committees first. So that will be Appropriations and Ways and Means. Then it will be T&I is kind of in that second group. And then there are smaller committees that come after that. Then in January, you will see at the very beginning of January, they will do the appointments to the committees. They do them by resolutions where they just name all the committee members. And then at the end of January, again, this is typical schedule, you would see them actually name all of the subcommittee members and go through that process. So it's somewhat of a multi-stage process. I think, a couple keys there. One is to the extent you have strong supporters, particularly thinking about the House for a minute, where you're going to see the most change. You're going to be a lot of Republicans added to committees. They have the majority. They're going to have more seats on committees. There are Democrats who are more likely to get thrown off committees because they're going to have fewer seats. So, if you have Republicans who would be a good fit, say, for the T&I committee, be working with them to make that their top priority in terms of their requests. If you think they're a transit supporter, that's the general way the process works.
Katie, any other thoughts there? You said, Katie? All right, well, we'll go ahead and kind of tidy things up here. Just want to say, following Ward's thoughts there, it's your new members of Congress in the House or the Senate are going to have priorities that you touch on every day with your services, whether it's caring for veterans or getting people to healthcare, education, the environment, whatever their particular focus is. You're doing something with that with your team at your agency, and connect with them on that level before we start talking about individual, especially new members. They have priorities too, and you can be a resource to them, guaranteed, with the work you're already doing at your agency. So it's going to be tough to get transit priorities adopted and elevated in this divided political climate. Our legislators need to know how much what you do is supporting what they do critically and is very much appreciated. So your assignment as we get through this new Congress is to bolster your elected officials, educate them on what you can do to support their community, and tell your stories like we've been talking about throughout this session, how you are putting that IIJA money to work every day. Give our elected officials and decision makers every reason to continue that level of investment. Also think about what your needs are. You heard Katie talk about that earlier, and keep sharing those with your members. Other competing sectors are also going to be in Washington telling their story. I know some of you will be perhaps coming to DC in the spring, as well as doing virtual meetings. Keep telling that story. We've got to keep our voices out there all the time. The last thing we want to be known is not giving our input on any matter, whether they vote for us or not, we don't want to ever hear somebody say, well, we never heard from you on that. So think about your stories and what your needs are. And we really appreciate you all joining us today. We'll have a recording of this session sent out through the state transit associations. If you've got ideas for future webinars that you'd like to see this group put on, please let us know. Thank you for continuing to be a great asset to your state transit associations, your regional transit associations, as well as the national ones of APTA and CTAA. So we want to thank our presenters here today, Ward, Katie, and Scott, for joining us. And I want to thank my colleagues, Lisa Guthrie from Virginia, Lisa Bacot from Florida for her co-hosting today, as well as our other state associations who helped organize this group in this session. So a happy and healthy Thanksgiving to you all. And we'll see you all again real soon. Be safe and take care. Thanks for joining us.